Ladies and gentlemen, when Les Miserables popularized this idea of letting the people sing and hearing the voices of the people, we say that it's not actually that good in reality. That in most dictatorial regimes, in most countries or states where the people are being oppressed, you don't actually often hear the voices of angry men. Because in reality, what we see is a crackdown of dictators of their people. What we see are situations more like Syria and not so much like Paris in the 19th century. What we see is bloodshed, is the dictator being cornered and therefore fighting back, using all its means possible in order to combat the people rising up against him. And that is why, on side proposition today, we say we support the foreign assassination of dictators in certain circumstances. In my speech today, firstly, I'll start with laying down the principle that proposition stands for. The idea of minimizing damage, a utilitarian approach, which we say we want to sacrifice this one life in exchange for the greater good of the many. Secondly, we'll move on to analyze the nature of dictators and how they're being irrational and capricious and therefore very unpredictable, and finally explain how this is actually a catalyst for toppling, or perhaps the start of the toppling of many dictatorial regimes. We'd like to clarify that today we would contextualize it and say we're not saying assassination is a legitimate diplomatic tool that everyone should use in every circumstance. What we're saying today is that it is a last resort. When we're dealing with very extreme circumstances, we say this is a legitimate way out. Our extension will be this idea of mutual interest on a mass scale, looking at the international stage as a whole. But firstly, before we go into this first principle, just a few clarifications of today's debate. This idea of assassination, we're talking about extrajudicial killing, this idea of removing a dictator once and for all by a foreign power, a foreign intervention. The idea of dictators, we're talking about a governmental authority figure which has overstepped an authority, overstepped the political legitimacy granted to him within the people. We say we want to remove these dictators. Yes, sir.
Would you assassinate Kim Jong-un?
Sir, what we're saying today is that we're not going to judge on a case-by-case basis as to, okay, we're going to assassinate this country's dictator and not this other country's. What we're saying is that we're going to advocate this broad principle, the idea that we want to legitimize this as a tool, as a diplomatic, yes, sir, a diplomatic mechanism for dealing with certain extreme circumstances. And going back into the principle, this idea of the utilitarian approach. Because what we say is a lot of these dictators that we see around the world today are basically wreaking havoc within their own regimes. We see in places like Malawi, for example, when dictators actually send letter bombs to all their political opponents and therefore destroy all the political opponents within a state. What we see is that in these particular dictatorial regimes, we see these dictators having absolute power and no checks and balances within the government. We say that these dictators are able to exploit the power granted to them in a very illegitimate means, and because these dictators very often have a military backing, the idea that they were able to rise into power was because they have the backing of the military. We say that when you corner these dictators, when you threaten these dictators, when you try to take away their power in a means that is not as extreme as assassination, what you have is a fighting back, being backed into a corner, in which case there is even more bloodshed and even more damage to the country as a whole. And we say that when you have this sort of context, when you have this sort of background, what we say today is that we want to deal with the root of the problem. We want to deal with this problem and cut off the cancer's growth by removing the center of that power, the root of the whole problem within a dictatorial regime. So as I later analyze for you in my speech, the idea is within a dictatorial regime, the governmental structure is not like, say, other democracies where there are branches of power. We say that the power actually originates from that one figure at the center of this whole web. So what we say today is because we advocate for saving the lives and the stability of the entire regime, we don't want more bloodshed, we don't want the people to be oppressed, to have, say, for example, in Zimbabwe, to have land taken away from farmers who legitimately deserve their land. We say we want to sacrifice and take out and remove that one power figure. And before opposition comes out and says, oh, we need to protect things like sovereignty, like respecting diplomatic and foreign boundaries, what we say today is that when you have a country which has already been that the legitimacy and authority of the government has already been undermined, we say we don't really think things like sovereignty stands in a situation when you have a dictator in place. When the people are being oppressed, we say that other states have the authority to come in and try and rescue the oppressed. But moving on to analyze this idea of the nature of dictators. Because we say we can't rationally understand and estimate the motives and consequences of what a dictator will do when you do certain things to the dictator. Plus, we say dictators, by their very definition, are people who are very irrational in what they do. That are people who have seized the power within a government, and are people who want to hang on to their ideological grasp over the power of their country. What we see is that these dictators want to maintain their grasp on power, they want to maintain their stronghold within the governmental hierarchy, as David Minster. And therefore, when you have a dictator backed up into a corner, when the people try to rise up against him, or when there's a revolution within that very country, what we see is actually a backlash where the dictator lashes out and tries to fight back. And we say that amount of bloodshed and damage and havoc that is wreaked is actually much worse than removing that dictator himself. Yes, sir?
You're assuming that all assassinations are successful. What if it's a failed assassination,
No, sir.
such as the situation of Fidel Castro? What exactly is your ultimate intention there?
What we're saying today is that, number one, we never said from the beginning that this assassination is going to be successful. We absolutely accept and concede that many of these, that the attempt of an assassination, what we're saying today is that the idea is, and I'll move on to my last point about the catalyst for the toppling of a regime, is the idea that when you have a foreign intervention into a dictatorial stronghold, when the people of that dictatorial regime realize that this charismatic dictator is not infallible, that the political rhetoric about this infallible regime being able to oppress the people is not actually true. When there are outside forces actively trying to undermine the legitimacy of a dictator, we say this actually sends a message that this is no longer an infallible, charismatic personality cult. But finally, wrapping up this idea of the nature of dictators, what we want to establish is the idea that we have dictators out there who are so capricious and so irrational and want to cling onto the power in whatever means possible. So other rational incentives, such as trying to invite these dictators out, trying to hold peace talks, for example, simply does not apply when we're talking about a dictator who is willing to harm its own people in order to maintain his authority. So we say in certain situations like this, when we're dealing with irrational people, an assassination may be the only way out. And finally, so why and what are the effects to the regime as a whole? As I just explained, the idea is within a dictatorial regime, very often that governmental structure stems from that one center personality figure. For example, even using your example of Fidel Castro, the idea is Castro tries to maintain that personality cult, trying to maintain that he is always healthy, that he is an immortal political figure. What we say is when you actually remove that figure, or when the foreign forces try and attempt to actually bring down that dictatorship as a regime, what we see is we're actually able to undermine that rhetoric that the dictatorship is able to use. We actually bring down that personality cult that we see, and therefore start a crack dictatorial regime that we see in many of these countries. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, proposition is not going to tell you that this is always going to work. That when you assassinate a leader, therefore there's going to be a democratic paradise. What we're telling you is that this is a legitimate tool, and that's why this is right.
Aside from opposition today, we actually have a contrasting picture. We're speaking to 50 people being repressed in dictatorial regimes, who relying on the CIA's sponsored assassination, they're openly ushered in a new era of dictatorship towards the Arab Spring, where people try to fight for their own futures, where credible oppositions could be built instead of the hugely efficient but hugely detrimental arena that assassination actually creates. On the side of opposition today, we're going to bring to you two major arguments. Firstly, we're going to talk about the legal principle of why extrajudicial killings are never viable. Secondly, we're going to look at the practical impact on these dictatorships, and why we think there are only 3 paths to go, and all of them means all hell breaks loose. But before we go on to those 2 major arguments, let's begin with what opponents actually brought to us, because they brought us 3 major arguments. They began with the principle and how they want to minimize damage. Secondly, they talked about unpredictability and finding this catalyst in toppling dictatorial regimes. Now, first, we want to contest this, because I asked them in the POI about whether they want to assassinate Kim Jong-un, and their response was, oh, today I'm not going to talk about specific dictators, we're going to talk about the general principle. What that shows, ladies and gentlemen, is that they have no idea what kind of last resort they're talking about, what kind of situation they're talking about. Why are they so fearful of telling us that, ladies and gentlemen? Because they know if they said they would assassinate Kim Jong-un, his uncle is going to take over with all the military and nothing is going to change. That is the reality side opposition wants to paint. So let's begin with the principle they gave us. Because basically our opponents had 2 points. Firstly, they said, oh, they're militarily backed, and you know, they're backed in the corner. Those are really crazy things. So you kill him with all the institutions in place, entrenched interests that are going to take over right away? No, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that logic works. But secondly, they have this major assumption that basically predicates the entire case. that all of the power in dictatorships root from one single person, and when you remove this person, it's going to magically disappear. No, ladies and gentlemen. Most of these people, including people like Bashar al-Assad, including people like Kim Jong-un, all these people grant specific powers to people with special relationships around them, a sort of crony of special people they like. All of these people won't be killed unless you want to wipe out the entire ruling class in these countries, ladies and gentlemen. These people are going to take over, or they're going to fight with each other and descend the whole country into civil war. It's not going to work, ladies and gentlemen. Second major argument they gave us: you can't estimate dictators' actions. They said, well, when you back them into a corner, they're going to go crazy. First of all, we contest this. We say that in fact dictators do have political calculus. They're more predictable in the same way Bashar al-Assad at the moment is continually conceding to their people. Basically saying, why don't we change a bit of the constitution? Why don't we concede some more to you? These people do know political calculus. But more importantly, we need to put this in context. What are we actually facing here? If we don't take away these people with some form of rational political calculus, you have a whole all-hell scenario where all of these people, warlords and their own special interests, the military fighting against each other. All of these people are unpredictable. Ladies and gentlemen, it's even worse. So ladies and gentlemen, we believe that both of their arguments have entirely crumbled. And finally, when they told us about this idea, well, when you remove this, it'll slowly break down. Well, we said no. If you kill Fidel Castro, Raul Castro has already taken over. It's going to take over, ladies and gentlemen. It's not going to change anything. But more importantly, let's assume they're really so brainwashed, right? As they said, they have a whole brainwashed regime, right? Then all the people are going to rise up and say, a foreign country just assassinated our leader. We hate them. We want to invade their country. The same thing that happened in the Rwandan massacre. When their leader died in a plane crash, people said that who just assassinated them, started a whole civil war and a whole genocide in their own country. Ladies and gentlemen, not working. All three of the arguments have entirely crumbled. So let's begin with our own case. What are we actually going to do today? Side opposition is a rational side. We're going to tell you about, firstly, the whole idea of the legal principle we need to stand for. This whole idea that extrajudicial killings are never, ever justified. First, we need to analyze. Why do we want to depose these dictators in the very first place? Because we think, as they conceded, they're taking law into their own hands. They're basically determined by personal interest, and they're doing it by dominating what the legal system considers as right and wrong. Secondly, they're basically actively killing their own people. Let's compare this to what our opponents are suggesting. They're basically saying, in this whole international arena where there is already international consensus, that these dictators need to be tried in an international criminal court. They will take the law into their own hands and kill them, ladies and gentlemen. We think that, in effect, our opponents are committing the same mistake dictators have committed from the very first place. Extrajudicial killings are never justified. But why do we have this international consensus, no thank you ma'am, on the fact that international law should be used to judge these dictators? We look at people like Charles Taylor, who was successfully indicted by an international court and basically sentenced to 50 years in prison. We think this is a far better way, ladies and gentlemen, to give the people justice and not use the dictators' own methods to indict themselves. We think it's a far better way for a justified system that is regulated to do this. More importantly, we think that when you're actually trying to do a secret assassination of these dictators, you'll never be able to find international consensus. It will always be unilateral action. Why? Because are you guys going to go to the United Nations and start a resolution of, we want to assassinate Kim Jong-un? What's Kim Jong-un going to react like? I'm going to start a nuclear weapon before you kill me, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't work that way. So let's move on to our second major argument. This idea that we're exacerbating existent conflicts. Now, firstly, we need to look at the efficient nature of assassinations.
Sir.
Because it happens too quickly. I'm going to take you right now.
Sir, I don't think the heinous crimes that some of these dictators actually commit actually takes an international consensus to actually condemn this person.
Well, man, that was not what I was saying, right? Basically, even if you have, like, international consensus, or if you're doing it unilaterally, it's still wrong, because extrajudicial killings are never justified. You should go through an international legal process to indict them. It's not simply about the consensus to kill that person in the very first place. Moving on with that whole idea of the efficient nature of assassination. Because it's too quick, ladies and gentlemen. There's no time to build a credible Now you need an immediate replacement for him. Our question inside opposition is very simple. Who's left? We think there are three paths. All of them are really, really bad. The first major path you could choose is basically the military and existent interests. We think that when you need immediate change, the military is the only kind of interest which has the via power to take over the country and basically impose a regime of fear. That's usually what happens. Now imagine this. In Thailand, when someone was normally basically removed, the military took over. If you imagine even in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, his uncle basically owned the entire country with the military. The military is going to take over. We think the centralization of power means that the military is the only actor that is ready. But secondly, let's also look at this whole idea of a lack of credible opposition and how this could descend into warlordism. Because if no one is ready for it, all of these interests will basically think, here's an opportunity to take over power. These are people who back up the dictatorial regimes, have all the money, dominated the ruling classes, who also had some form of power, supported relationships within the military. These people will send into a factional fight. Even if you do have some kind of credible position, such as Morgan Tsvangirai, who basically is in a power-sharing relationship with Robert Mugabe. If Robert Mugabe dies today, ladies and gentlemen, his own cronies are going to fight against Morgan Tsvangirai anyway. So credible position doesn't make a difference either, ladies and gentlemen. It's always going to be backed. But finally, this final point about backlash, because we think that in fact, on the other whole basic scenario, we think that what's going to happen is that you're going to send these whole dictatorships from one single person's power towards a whole bunch of people they loved in the back then fighting against each other. We think that's even more predictable and even more destructive. That's why we're very proud of this.
Side opposition today seems to believe that Arab Spring is the norm. They seem to believe that countries with such dictatorial regimes can easily break out of such holds. And we on side proposition object to this because we believe in a lot of these scenarios, in a lot of these cases, these dictators have a very oppressive stronghold on the country and on the people in terms of control. And we say it is not that easy to break out. And we are for the decentralization of such power so that the people at least have the first chance at regrouping together. Now, today what I'm going to be talking about is firstly this idea of who will fill the vacuum, or whether there will be a factionalism left behind once these dictators are removed. This idea of anti-Western sentiment or rhetoric, the idea of legal or extrajudicial killings, and also this idea of an international consensus. In my main substantive, I will be talking about nations with their economic investments in countries and the right to protect certain properties and other rights. Now, firstly on this issue of who will fill the gap once the dictators are assassinated. Now, no thank you, sir. Their first contention would be that the family that the dictator came from would step up to fill such a gap. But ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the action, no thank you, sir, that removed the dictators to begin with. The dictators were assassinated. What family member in their right mind would want to step up into the very position that just got their brother or father or some other family member killed? No thank you, sir. Tell me, where is the rational calculus in that, given even conceding your supposed rational calculus description of the family members and of the dictators? Next, on this, no thank you, sir, on this issue of cronyism, you talked about how it will be the military that replaces the dictators. But let's really look at dictatorial regimes and break down how they work. The thing is, a lot of dictatorial regimes is not broken up into different cronies. A lot of the decisions are referred back to the dictator. It's a top-down version where there is a lot of perhaps a lot of certain factions and as such, but ultimately the final decision rests within the dictator, and they are the ones that are holding the structure together. That is the point of a dictatorial regime, and that is why we believe assassinating them will decentralize such a power. It will render the military more difficult to amass such centralization of power. No, thank you, sir. And from the very beginning, we were never advocating that this would be a perfect kind of democracy left place. But the thing is, you have to understand what the status quo is right now. You have to understand that you do, perhaps at some point, sometimes even factionalism can be good in terms of decentralizing the power and allowing certain factions to get control of other factions, to at least different political parties, different kind of discourses, different kind of dissemination of different ideas and possible forms of government. Because right now, there's only one form of government in this kind of dictatorial regime. Next on this issue of the anti-Western sentiment. Before I move on, yes, sir.
You just conceded that factionalism is good and you want to intervene to assassinate Assad.
Sir, we're talking about this kind of issue where Assad is killing thousands by the day. This kind of factionalism that we see here, you're operating under the assumption that these factionalism, these different factions aren't able to somehow introduce a new or better kind of form of government. Because we see whatever kind of government that's introduced from then on, we see the dictatorship that we have here is the baseline. It's the worst you can go. Anything else you introduce, it could possibly introduce new, better ideas or systems of government which you don't even entertain under your current status quo. Now, under the anti-Western sentiment, this kind of rhetoric, we didn't say the people believed in the government, that they liked the dictatorship. We said the dictatorship had a stronghold in terms of controlling the populace. So we don't see how this anti-Western sentiment rhetoric works. But we see even if it did, we see actually the current status quo, a better description of it, is that people have a lot of anti-Western sentiment because they believe that countries are afraid of intervening in their country. They are afraid of saving the people. They are afraid of assassinating their dictatorship because they're hiding under the guise of sovereignty. And we say that is unacceptable, and that is even more. No, thank you, sir. That gives so much more disillusionment to the natives of the land. And on this issue, no, thank you, sir, of this kind of legal extrajudicial killings. Now, they seem to believe that we have all the luxury in the world in terms of time. But ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking. We cannot simply kidnap these dictators and negotiate somehow the judicial process. We see that kind of system takes time. And every second you spend longer on that kind of system, that process, we see thousands of others are dying. And we see we just don't have that kind of luxury in the current status quo. And in terms of the unilateral action that we have here, we seem to believe that somehow if we negotiated to the already pretty much broken system of the United Nations, we will reach an international consensus. Please, ladies and gentlemen, we can't even reach an international consensus on a lot of very basic things. How would we ever reach an international consensus? No, thank you, sir, on this thing to begin with. Any action in terms of assassination in this form will be unilateral. And we see an emergency case where the system, no, thank you, sir, where the situation is so bad. We see in emergencies, you don't consult your members. Oh dear, should we go in? Do you agree with this? No, you go in and you assassinate the dictator because it's the right thing to do, and it's because you need to save people at the end of the day. Now to my main substantive. We see a lot of cases here, nations do have these kinds of economic investments in certain countries, and they do have the right to protect these interests and rights. No, thank you, sir. We see this kind of protection of interests and rights. Should they be compromised by the dictatorship? Because the dictatorship has already evidenced that they don't have legitimacy as a form of government because they do not hold any kind of strings attached to the people. They do not represent the people in any way. They are not entertaining different political parties, different kind of ideas whatsoever. This kind of stronghold shows their lack of legitimacy and their absolute lack in terms of control, in terms of exploiting the kind of economic investments other countries have in that country. No, thank you, sir. And we say this is why countries have the responsibility and even the right to hold up this kind of peace and stability and framework of economic rights in these new places. And we see this process of holding up law and respecting this international framework is exactly what side opposition wants, but has failed to fulfill. What do you have to say to that, sir?
What exactly is your yardstick for a country to go in and assassinate? You say there's no consensus, it's based on time, and it's also based on utility.
So we already told you from our very first speaker, very well outlined, that when a dictator is so irrational, killing at a massive going on a massive killing spree, you see this kind of situation is unacceptable, and that's when we assassinate dictators. Especially when we see that this dictator is the kind of angry mad dog, has angry mad dog syndrome, where they'll lash back out even further so should you try to remove them through other sanctions, through economic sanctions or military intervention. So ladies and gentlemen, what have I told you at the end of the day? I've talked about who will fill the gap and how in the end it's better for breaking that kind of crack for the people so that they can at least start the beginnings of perhaps even a democracy. Then I've talked about this kind of anti-Western sentiment. I've talked about the extrajudicial killing and how that doesn't stand up in the face of time. And the idea of a unilateral consensus, a unilateral decision with no international consensus. And finally, this idea of nations protecting and upholding a legal framework. So do not condemn those under dictatorships just because you are just as afraid as side opposition.
Side propositions' principal justification is based on utility and time. When we question them to why this mechanism will work, they tell us it's because these dictators are irrational and because factionalism is good. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a complete misconceptualization upon the nature of not only dictatorship, but more importantly, the mechanism of assassination. And we're going to expose why they felt terribly wrong from the very start through looking at two main questions. Firstly, looking at directly what happens after assassination, and secondly, the principal justification of utilitarianism and minimizing damage. Then I'm going to look at further extending opposition's case, looking at why vested interest undermines the legitimacy and the effectiveness of this assassination. So let's move straight into the meat of the first one, the effects of what happens after assassination. Because in here they assume that dictatorships are centralized power and that they're irrational, so therefore assassination will work. Let's try to actually deconstruct this. Because when they say they centralize dictatorships and centralized power, this is completely wrong. In all three of the examples of Syria, Zimbabwe, and Mali, in all three of these cases, the dictatorships don't actually centralize power. Where in fact this power is actually deep-rooted and spread throughout different factions, something they actually conceded as being a good thing. In Syria, the situation of the Alawari elitist hierarchy structure, and secondly in Mugabe, who has promised power to 12 different parties after he's going to die. In Mali, the separation between the separatists and the Islamists and the Tuaregs in the north. Ladies and gentlemen, this is clearly not just one individual holding power. The second idea of how dictatorships are irrational. This completely works for us, ladies and gentlemen, because this is predicated on the assumption that all assassinations will work, and that some in situations where you do assassinate, somehow the whole regime will rationalize itself, and suddenly we will have all these check and balance mechanisms. We tell you this is completely wrong. We see the situation, for example, the failed attempt of assassination with Fidel Castro, or even worse, with Raul Cedras in Haiti in the 1990s. In these form of examples, where in fact a failed assassination actually thrills the credence of these dictatorships, fundamentally counterintuitive to the justification. Finally, this idea of personal clout. This again proves our point. It's because this idea of the strong attachment and the strong devotion given to that dictatorship perfectly shows that the regime will not fall down when this dictator is actually assassinated. So we think all this analysis actually works for our side. And the second idea when they talked about this is that, well, they have no interest because that in fact sons will not actually rise up. This is completely wrong. We look at the example of the assassination of Trujillo in Dominican Republic in 1960. It was his son Ramphis that actually rises up to power in most of these situations, because it's that sort of familial hierarchy and familial relationship. It's most often the sons that actually rise up. So this idea of principle, second contention of the principle justification. They said that people are oppressed and that there's no check and balances, and our yardstick is based on the time and also utilitarianism. Firstly, we think this is completely wrong, because just because you prove that people are being oppressed, this doesn't then validate assassination. This proposition fundamentally missed the boat upon the mechanism of assassination. This debate is about showing why, in fact, assassination actually leads to greater utility. Because this idea of utilitarianism is based on the assumption I'll teach you in a second, the assumption that this will actually lead to greater utility. So in fact, that if you can't prove that this will lead to greater utility, this principle justification falls by itself. So how do we respond to that?
But we already told you, sir, that we're stemming the problem at the root cause.
So exactly what is this root cause, ladies and gentlemen? They tell us this root cause is that, there's no check and balance mechanism. This root cause is this dictator. We told you at the first speaker with no response that the dictators the regime doesn't simply fall when the dictator falls. In fact, often the dictators entrench power within multiple factions, which we see in the most extreme part of opposition when they say that factionalism is a good thing, and so therefore by assassinating dictators, therefore factionalism will somehow balance the power, and therefore we will actually progress in that way. This is completely wrong to show the fact that there will be a power struggle. Essential analysis of my first opposition never responded. So we think this idea of utilitarianism doesn't actually work. And they try to mischaracterize us, because then throughout the debate they try to say, oh, we're defending sovereignty. No, ladies and gentlemen, we're not defending Saudi. If you listen very carefully to my first statement, what we said is the idea of how you undermine the international precedent for international law, never responded by side of proposition. We tell you that, in fact, fundamentally, each time you actually assassinate a dictator, you further actually undermine that collective adherence to this international law. So fundamentally clearing those two questions, let's move on to the second extent of why this vested interest. Because we don't believe in this virtuous and utopian idea that foreign powers always assassinate based on humanitarian politics. Most situations is based upon vested strategic interest of strengthening geopolitical alliance or further economic interests. Why? Because assassination bears a large cost. And in fact, the failure of doing so bears a large cost on the side of the foreign power. We see, in fact, in the situations such as the CIA in South America throughout the 60s and 70s, where the assassination of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic in 1961 actually led to the Dominican Republic Civil War. How did this happen? It's simply because the fact that assassination was used by the current regime in further justifying their cause. So you further fuel the credence for these for anti-Western centric upheld by the regime itself. And in fact, we saw that this actually fundamentally doesn't actually help actually topple the regime. What we think is that this idea of vested interest is principally illegitimate, that states shouldn't engage in such assassination based on meeting their own strategic interests, because it further undermines the adherence for international law. But moreover, we say that in fact, this idea that this idea that vested interest actually fundamentally undermines the actual effectiveness of toppling that regime. Because this idea of the priority of interest, here the priority of interest is trying to meet the strategic interest instead of actually protecting civilians or instead of trying to topple that regime. This was perfectly elucidated in the case of the CIA's attempt to assassinate the Guatemalan dictator of United Fruit Company, which actually led to more than 20,000 civilian deaths. Because in that instance, their main aim is trying to topple the regime, not in fact actually holding any obligation whatsoever to actually adhere to basic principles of protecting civilians. So we don't think it's this black and white picture that because people are oppressed, suddenly foreign powers intervening, therefore they actually protect civilians. But moreover is this analysis that in fact vested interests are dynamic. The perfect reason why, in fact, we see in CIA support for things such as for dictators such as Mobutu or even Mubarak, because the fact that these interests, this sort of vested interest is dynamic, means that there's no absolute validation of this assassination in the first place. But moreover, is that these foreign powers in the future have to actually aim to reconcile or even try to reconstruct this form of relationship, which further reinforces this idea of Western hypocrisy, where in situations their vested interest dramatically swap, to dramatically changes under long term. So what's the end conclusion of this idea? We think the fundamental problem is that this actually doesn't actually help the idea of trying to aid civilian interest, but more importantly undermines the very purpose of that assassination on principle level, but more importantly, the effectiveness of that assassination. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think side opposition simply can come up and say there's oppressed people, so therefore we need to assassinate. They need to actually focus on the mechanism of assassination and why this will actually lead to toppling the regime. On those grounds, we beg to oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we ask a very simple question. We ask freedom at what cost? No matter how much side opposition has been showering us with examples, today in my speech, I am going to take a look at the logic and the principles of today's debate and show you why their logic doesn't stand, their principles don't stand, and ours do. We tell you cannot predict the outcomes of any revolution, but we tell you that we're taking here the solution with the least possibility of a bloodshed, and that we treasure civilian lives above any other else. And we tell you through three key flashes of today's debate, we tell you why we have taken today's debate. Firstly, is it principally justified? And secondly, on the people, and thirdly, on the possibility of regime change. So firstly, let's take a look at the fact that whether the motion is principally justified or not. We told you at the very beginning we're taking a very utilitarian stance to this motion and to how actually we adapt to international politics. They told you, well, killing is still wrong, therefore the motion is wrong. They also told you international law is supreme and therefore it is always right. We tell you, firstly, we have already told you, no thank you sir, how basically the ends justify the means, especially in international politics. We tell you why, basically, simply because killing is wrong doesn't mean that taking a life away from a dictator who has probably done more evil than anybody else in the history of time. Taking away that kind of life, we say that's fundamentally morally justified. We don't see anything principally wrong with that. But secondly, let's take a look at further their idea of international law, right? Because basically, what they have been championing down the bench is the fact that international law is supreme and therefore cannot be actually overstepped. We tell you when we take a look at very specifically the international paradigm and how different nations actually function and interact together. We tell you in the international paradigm, the fact that there are overarching legal institutions or international laws is fundamentally a fallacy. We tell you in the international paradigm, we tell you there are actually no overarching legal institutions, and therefore we actually take the fact, we actually no thank you sir, we actually trust these countries to actually take the matter into their own hands. So we tell you in the international paradigm, where this debate is actually happening, we tell you there are no this kind of legal institutions we can depend on. Therefore, we actually trust these rational nations to actually take matter into their own hands and actually assassinate these dictators. And secondly, they actually talked about how this is the right way to do it, taking a look at Charles Taylor, because it was somehow justified. We tell you that he was promised money and immunity, therefore that is the reason why he gave up power. We tell you this is actually what they promised him, and what happened was that he was prosecuted and put in prison. If this is what your idea of morality is, then you guys are pretty damn evil. We tell you this is fundamentally not true. We tell you this is fundamentally, principally justified. No thank you, sir. But secondly, let's take a look at the people, right? Because basically they have been banging about on the idea of civil war and fascism. No thank you, sir. We tell you it happens either way. In both circumstances, whether the people rise up or we take out the country's leader or the dictator. In either way, bloodshed may happen. There may be civil war. There may be fascism. But the difference with actually an assassination of the dictator is that we actually take out that hit. We actually use a sort of sniper-like strike to actually take out that leader. That kind of method is actually prevents blood loss in most kind of way. What happens afterwards is irrelevant because we tell you it actually can happen either way. We tell you at the very beginning of my speech that we cannot actually predict how these things actually unfold. We tell you how this kind of idea can actually does not apply in this debate. We're actually debating about possible consequences. Yes, sir.
If I say what happens after is irrelevant, then your whole principle of utilitarianism falls because you need to prove to us why this will lead to greater utility in the first place.
It leads to greater utility in the first place because you prevent immediate harm, immediate threat. You remove that immediate threat to the people. We're not telling you that bloodshed will not happen after we assassinate them. So that's impossible to defend. But what we're telling you is basically in either circumstance, bloodshed may still happen. We're just taking the route that will prevent the most sort of bloodshed and the most sort of civilian deaths. But secondly, let's take their idea of this sort of international consensus and why this will actually never happen. Therefore, the motion doesn't stand. We tell you international consensus rarely, no, sorry, did I say rarely? It never happens. International consensus never happens. But even more than that, we tell you basically things like mass murder, genocide. If countries, no thank you sir, try to defend these two things, you have got to be nuts. We tell you, no thank you sir, if countries actually try to defend things like mass murder and genocide, we tell you these things are actually things that are not very contested by these very countries. We tell you the decisions to actually take out these dictators are not very contentious or very controversial in the first place. We tell you, therefore, their logic on that matter is false. But thirdly, let's take a look at regime change, right? No, thank you, sir. Because basically, they actually told you how, you have these cronies and these family members. Therefore, the possibility of regime change after you take out that sort of leader is impossible. But we told you the very preemptive nature of this attack actually keeps you from actually advising that sort of question time. No, thank you, sir. When you take out that leader, this sort of very preemptive attack, you actually send the entire dictatorial regime into chaos. And that kind of chaos actually buys you very precious time for either the people to rise up against them or for the whole regime to collapse. We say this is fundamentally a very good thing. And we also told you, and reinforcing the idea of the nature of the dictatorial system, we tell you how the dictator actually builds the entire regime around him. We tell you fundamentally a lot of dictatorial regimes are very personal. They are built on things such as personal charisma. They're built around a single person. And if you take away that keystone of that monument, then the monument collapses, or at least stands a very large chance of collapsing. We tell you how these people actually build themselves up as a personality cult, as to actually rule over and to consolidate their own legitimacy. You take away that person during which the cult was actually built around, you are doing a very good thing, because in effect, you're toppling the regime. No, thank you, sir, at least in a very ideological sense. What comes afterwards, we take. But we see, therefore, this is the way that actually prevents the most sort of blood loss. And we tell you even more that the possibility of a regime change is not something we have to even defend on side proposition. I already told you how basically we never actually have to justify why it will immediately or effectively lead to regime change. All we have to prove on side proposition is that it has the possibility of bringing more good than harm to the people and to the international community. And down the bench, we told you basically how you can take out that key leader, that keystone in that monument within a regime. You are effectively removing an immediate threat to the people within that country, removing an immediate threat to the international community. When you actually take a look at the fact that how dictators are actually fundamentally capricious, how they're fundamentally a threat to international security. These are things that they actually never try to justify on their side of the house. We tell you how basically, if you look at the very fact that when you look at the immediacy of the effect, we tell you we actually take that argument. What happens in the future is actually can be taken by both sides of the house. Therefore, we feel that it can be left for debate. We feel that this is something that we can happily concede and still win the debate. Ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of my speech, I asked, freedom at what cost? We say freedom at the cost of the people is something that cannot be avoided. But if the international community has the power to do something to stop this sort of bloodshed from happening, or at least minimize the bloodshed of these very people, we tell you this is something that the international community will do if they can and if it's justified. We tell you it is justified, it will work, and it will bring about more good than harm. We are very proud to propose, and we see that the motion will stand, unlike the dictators that we are trying to topple. Thank you very much.
Side proposition conceded, they contracted, and they misinterpreted. And that's why they lose today's debate. They conceded that factionalism is an essential and inherent part of dictatorial countries with dictatorial regimes. They contracted to the third speaker and said that now it's only about possibility, that now it's about eliminating that threat and no longer about transitioning into a government. They misinterpreted by pushing us into defending sovereignty and defending nations that should defend things like manslaughter, crimes against humanity. We think this is a side which ultimately doesn't understand the dynamics in which dictatorial regimes operate and how they function within the country and into the international realm. I'm going to look at three issues. Firstly, I'm going to look at this idea of the nature and purpose of assassination. Second of all, the dynamics of dictators and dictatorial regimes. And finally, looking at the consequences in terms of what this brings for the government in the long run. So firstly, onto the issue of the nature and purpose of assassination. We questioned them at the very beginning. How do you judge whether an assassination is legitimate? Down the bench, we heard multiple responses. They said we should judge based on time. Then it's no longer an issue about last resort, right? It's an issue about which country gets to the dictatorial regime the fastest. Then they told us it's about irrationality. I mean, dictators are always irrational, and therefore we should try to assassinate every dictator. No, that's not how dictators operate, right? You don't judge dictators based on this whole issue of irrationality, and therefore you assassinate all dictators completely. And finally, they said, by third speaker, they said, we don't really need to regard about international precedents and laws. Countries should take it into their own hands. Now this is really where they lost the debate, because they're telling us that every international precedent and law set by the ICC and the motives of the United Nations to set a consensus on things like intervention is completely useless, and that countries should simply just take it into their own hands and assassinate whoever they believe is legitimate. And this can be even not just done by governments, right, but also by unilateral organizations like the CIA. So we say there's no stranglehold to impose on them. There's But principle here, under the nature and purpose of assassination, was that we should minimize utility, and that because right now the dictators are simply doing damage, we need to remove the threat. Now this doesn't win them the debate. The contention in which opposition objects is not whether we should deal with dictators, it's the mechanism in which we deal with dictators. So just by saying that we need to uphold this utilitarian principle is simply absurd. And bear in mind, that's not the principle that international politics even operates by, right? It's not that we see suffering, let's go in and assassinate the dictators. There are other issues to concern with. We gave you the principle extrajudicial killing, how you have to respect this sort of international law and precedent, because then it provides the opportunity for other organizations or countries to use assassination for their own interest and no response on our proposition. We further said it's not just about removing harm. You have to look at the consequences, right? Utilitarianism is looking at the long-term consequences. We showed you that it in fact causes more harm, right? They conceded this by saying that factionalism exists, but somehow a good thing, which I'll deal with later in the consequences clash. And the final argument here was that all resorts fail, and therefore we should use assassination. Now that's completely wrong. If we look at empirical evidence with the CIA, with Trujillo and Cesare, and also with the CIA in Mobutu, and also in Rwanda and Burundi, this was not the last resort, ladies and gentlemen, where in fact in most cases they did this for the purpose of prevention, precautionary measures in which the dictators might create even more bloodshed. But second of all, we say they're just arguing against the Arab Spring, right? There are legitimate and viable ways in which you can topple dictators, and assassination is not just the only form. Second contention on the dynamics of dictators and dictatorial regimes. My second speaker mainly dealt with this, but I'm going to go further. Because they said that the dictatorial regimes are the central power and the central figure within these regimes. Now let's look at how they actually come to that position, right? They do this through the support of military backing and the support of everyone within that regime. So what happens when you topple the central figure? Do you think that everyone within the regime is just going to back up and say, we're just going to let our central figure die and we're just going to let opposition blocks take over? No, we've seen this time and time again. Even in the case of New Guinea, where Burutu actually, in fact, the toppling of Burutu as a dictatorial regime, it caused further conflict within opposition blocks. So we say this idea of central figure doesn't stand. No, thank you. And furthermore, they kept on pushing this idea of root cause, that these dictators are the root cause, and therefore if you remove them, it's perfectly fine. We don't just consider the regime itself, right? We have to look at how the government transforms after the regime is toppled, right? In most cases, we see even within opposition blocks, the Free Syrian Army, for example, you have factions within, right? And therefore, these factions, in the process of trying to achieve the power, will cause further conflict. And the final issue on the consequences of assassination, before I want, yes.
Show us why the backlash you talked about your case are unique only to assassinations and not regime toppling in the general sense.
Well, we're not here to defend other mechanisms, right? Opposition's job here is only to object against assassination in its motion, not to defend other mechanisms that they push us upon our proposition. But on to the third issue of consequences. They said that no member, on second speaker, they said that no member in society has an incentive to topple the government and become the government. Because if your brother was suffering under this regime, then you have no incentive to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, every opposition block's motive and prime incentive is to take over the government, right? Why so? Because when they're disagreeing with the way that the country is run and the way that the Constitution especially governs the country, they want to change that, right? And the only way in which you do that is by becoming the government, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we see in most toppling of dictatorial regimes. So it's completely untrue that they have no incentive. And finally, they backed off and said, well, factionalism exists. It's a good thing because you're going to have multilateral consensus. Really? Because let's look at the groups that are actually involved. In most cases, the disagreements regard the way in which the government is governed, but also in which very personal issues, right? Religious values in a lot of these factions that exist in opposition blocks. And because of these disagreements, they have conflict in with regards to how the constitution is set up, for example, or essentially the way in which the government runs. So therefore, you have power struggle in the process. We gave you the example of Zimbabwe, where Mugabe promised to 12 different factions upon power, and all they said is that they're going to reach some consensus and they're going to form some form of government. No, that's not the reality. All of these factions have values and also way in which they govern the country very contrasting. So overall, ladies and gentlemen, on the three issues, we think that the side proposition has ultimately given us a very simplistic case. They said that it's about sniper rifles, it's about second speaker, the mad dog disease, but ultimately they haven't conceptualized exactly how dictators function within dictatorial regimes and the consequences of assassination, and because of this, we failed.
Let's try summarizing Proposition's case. The dictators hold all the power. They have the root of all the power in this country. What does that sound like? It sounds like the dictators' own propaganda. We're beginning to think, side Proposition, are the ones who are being indoctrinated by these dictators because they think that all the power comes from this godlike figure. It doesn't, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to try to say is that international consensus never works. International law doesn't have any value. People die, let's go in and kill them. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an American movie, it doesn't work in the real world. It boils down to two major questions. Is it justified? And secondly, will it actually work? In both cases, no, ladies and gentlemen. That's a simple answer. So is this justified? We told you from the very beginning of this debate that extrajudicial killings are never justified. That is an act of hypocrisy, that you're doing the exact same thing the dictators use to perpetrate their own regimes. That's how we think it goes against every single legal principle out there, especially that of international law. Opponents gave us three responses. The first response they gave was that so many people die, we have to go now, we'll kill them. The ends justify the means, ladies and gentlemen. George W. Bush speaking right there. What did that say? That's a unilateral interest, ladies and gentlemen. We asked them, what's your measure? Second major response, there's no international consensus. International consensus never works. When we told them about Charles Taylor, guess what their response was? They said, oh, Charles Taylor was given money, he was given immunity. And then he was tried and indicted and put into prison. Immunity, tried, ladies and gentlemen, they don't go together. They just explain our case for us, ladies and gentlemen. The international law does work, it indicts these dictators, and if you don't try to rely on international law, we're not saying it always works, but if you don't try to use it, ladies and gentlemen, you fall down to unilateral interests where countries can do whatever they want. So the final response they gave us was, what happens afterwards is irrelevant, ladies and gentlemen. They began this whole debate by saying the ends justify the means. They ended this debate by saying the ends don't really matter, ladies and gentlemen. So their means don't really matter. Ladies and gentlemen, that's why it's not justified at all. So let's move on to the second question. Will it actually work? We began this whole debate by saying, it's too quick, there's no credible position, and even if you do, it will still fall down to a huge arena of civil war or basically no change at all. They gave us 5 major responses. First thing we said, we cannot predict them. There will be less bloodshed using our method. We said no, it's more unpredictable, but you have multiple factions that don't know what they're doing fighting against each other, and do more bloodshed when they're fighting against each other, ladies and gentlemen, if that's simple. Second major response they gave us, well, the family will fear taking over because they fear being assassinated. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first one we question, are you going to basically kill everyone in a cycle so everyone in the ruling class is dead? No. But secondly, even if you did, like you just conceded that no one is there, like there's a power vacuum up there, so the factions are going to fight against each other, ladies and gentlemen. Third major response that they gave us, well, the military not going to take over because most decisions are made by the dictator. So if you remove the dictator, the military is going to be like a bunch of sheep who won't do anything. They're not sheep, ladies and gentlemen. It's very simple. If they have and monopolize the tools of oppression, and the dictator who oppressed other people is gone, they will take over, ladies and gentlemen, because they're the only viable actors who have an incentive in doing so. Fourth major response, well, basically, factionism is great. There'll be balance of power. Well, let's use the mad dog disease analogy. If you have 2 dogs and let them fight against each other, they won't suddenly balance each other out like in a cartoon movie. They about Mugabe, there's 12 parties fighting against each other. They say these 12 parties were using this mystical force of balancing each other out. They won't, ladies and gentlemen. Zimbabwe is going to get to civil war. At the end of this debate, side opposition brought to you maybe major things that are very simple to understand. Firstly, it's never justified to do this because you're doing exactly what the dictators love best. Secondly, it will never work because it's either civil war or the military takeover or basically no changes at all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, proposition was obviously making a very bad case to show that opposition was the better side, to show you guys that, well, our coach and our manager picked the better team. But at the end of the day, we think that it's actually opposition that's come out looking like dictators if they accuse us of being brainwashed and being sheep. We have an opposition that's mocked us from the very beginning, who sounded very self-righteous, who's been very charismatic, who tries to convince everyone that it's going to be just worse without them, and that, above all, they seek to crush their opponents mercilessly with all tactics possible, such as example loading, masculine bluffing, or simply using sarcasm even when uncalled for. But let's just sum up this debate very simply. Because amidst all the mad dog syndrome, the foul swearing, and the rifles that proposition has tried to tell you about, our case is that when you have these dictators who are presiding over a dictatorial regime, when these dictators are oppressing their people, when they're doing a lot of evil, when you have this way out, we say that this can be legitimate means to bring down this dictator. We've never said that this is going to cause a very, very good government within that regime. We've never said that factionalism will not occur. But at the same time, what we've told you from the beginning to the end is that when we remove that imminent threat, what we do is that we actually make sure that in this present moment, we actually reduce the bloodshed brought about by the oppression that the dictator is bringing about. So let's look back at the debate where we see it boils down to two major ideas. The principles of whether the utility approach we took was actually justified, and secondly, the practicalities and the consequences that comes about. Firstly, this idea of utilitarianism. Because in my very first speech, I came out here and I told you, our principle was that we want to minimize harm. We want to minimize the damage of oppression, the political torture of opponents, the absolute stronghold of authority that these leaders and dictators have. We told you that if we remove that one figure, we're not saying that this is going to magically solve everything, but what we say is that it's better to remove that one life extrajudicially, and therefore what we can do is that we remove that imminent threat for the time being. Our opponents came out and said, oh no, you can't do that, because that undermines the international legal framework, and as everyone knows, the international legal framework is really, really powerful, and every country adheres to it, such as the United States. But what we say today is that no, we don't actually believe that we can apply for an international consensus at the UN, where we're talking about a dictator that's actually crushing his people actively. What we say today is that we don't actually have the precedence, we don't have the luxury to go through all these processes. Yes, we agree that we are doing this extrajudicially. But as Eunice told you in her third speech, we're doing this as a last resort. We're doing this to make sure we stem the root cause and make sure we remove that imminent threat to reduce the damage done at the time being. So what we tell you is, yes, it is justified on the utilitarian approach. But secondly, the practicalities, which was opposition's entire case, about how all hell breaks loose whenever you remove that dictator. Which we told you, yes, we agree that it does. But the thing is, as of right now, you either have that dictator continue to suppress and oppress his people, or you have the fascism that already exists under that dictator anyway. What we told you was that when you actually take away that personality figure, you break down, you start to crack that hierarchy. What we do is you actually start to break down and dissolve the stronghold of power. You actually start to diffuse the power inside this regime. All they told us was that, well, they're going to fight each other like dogs and they're going to eat each other. But ladies and gentlemen, what we told you from the very beginning was we want to allow this dictator to be taken down. We want to start dissolving that personality hold that this dictator has over his cronies, over his family, over the people that worship him. We say, no, we don't think this is a perfect solution, but at the end of the day, the ends do justify the means. Please vote.